Welcome to our first major section on the history of Mormonism as part of our teaching curriculum on ministry here in Utah. Our first major section is going to focus on the religious and cultural milieu of Joseph Smith's day. Now, ideas don't come out of nowhere. They're born out of circumstances in society, and we've already argued in our introductory remarks that we are going to examine Mormonism from a historical and cultural perspective versus a divine perspective. When it comes to some of the theological underpinnings of Mormonism, we can see a lot of corollaries going on in the culture around Joseph Smith. His ideas are not unique to himself, though many Mormons may not recognize that. So let's talk about this idea of a burned-over district. If you've ever read anything about Mormonism, you've probably heard about the burned-over district. So in the United States, when people moved here, often we learn in elementary school that they did that for reasons of religious freedom. And it's certainly true that the United States was one of the first places where all different sorts of religions could coexist because people were given the freedom to do so, whereas in Europe, had they chosen to break off from the church, many times throughout history, people were unfortunately killed for that reason. But in the U.S., that was different. And when that happened, what that did was create a phenomenon what one historian has called the storming of heaven's back door, by which he meant the disestablishment of religious authority allowed different groups of people to invent new sorts of ideas and interpretations that could not have existed if they existed under a strict church authority structure. And Joseph Smith lived in this area called the Burned Over District because this area was constantly burning with the fires of religious revivals by these sorts of disenfranchised or disestablished religious people who had the freedom to go and preach different doctrines. So you would have a Presbyterian one week, a Wesleyan another week, or different groups perhaps from what was called the Restoration Movement, which we'll talk about in just a moment, coming all through this region of upstate New York in which Joseph Smith lived and what was considered to be the frontier of America at that time. And this is why there were so many different religious teachers in the U.S. And one idea that was particularly influential on Mormonism is something called restorationism or primitivism. So what is restorationism or primitivism, and why does it matter? Well, it's a theological framework of renewal within Protestant Christianity. The earliest roots lie in England and can be seen in groups like the early Puritans or the Baptists. And its most basic tenet is that the Protestant Reformation didn't go far enough. It didn't accomplish enough to bring the church back into fidelity. So restorationism saw that things needed to be restored, not simply to be fixed like a car engine. You need a new engine altogether, in many cases, is what restorationism or primitivism taught. For most primitivists or restorationists, they would argue that turning to the Bible alone would do the trick. The problem was that historical developments had come in, things like the liturgy or the use of church music, for example, and had muddied the waters. The Bible, in the view of many, was sufficient. The problem was that people had turned away from the Bible. And so we had people adopting John Calvin's regulative principle, in which it would be said that if you don't have a biblical example, a biblical command, or a necessary inference from the text of the New Testament, something was not appropriate to be practiced. And this is what restorationism or primitivism looked like in the time of Joseph Smith most often. People turning to the Bible to circumvent history in some ways and go back to the very earliest times and try and reconstitute what was considered to be apostolic Christianity. So if we were to summarize restorationism in the time of Joseph Smith, perhaps through a movement like the Restoration Movement, which still has churches today, you might see them if you've been in the South, more likely they would be considered the disciples of Christ or the churches of Christ. Three main assumptions. One, that the Bible is the only measure in line. No, not church tradition, not creeds or anything else. The Bible alone. that Christians living today, or at that time, could actually go back to the New Testament and live as New Testament Christians did. And third, that this is actually what the New Testament teaches, that we are supposed to be doing this. So, this idea was prevalent in the time of Joseph Smith. In fact, Sidney Rigdon, an early Mormon, came out of the Restoration movement himself. So Joseph Smith was absolutely influenced by streams of restorationist or primitivist thought. However, he adapted that stream of thought and made it unique within Mormonism. And here's how that works. So you'll remember the famous verse from the Joseph Smith History 119, where he claims that he went to speak to God in the sacred grove and was told that none of the churches were right and he shouldn't join any of them. And this is the foundational aspect of Mormonism, because what is being said by God to Joseph is that there was a great apostasy, that all the churches became corrupt and that the Bible itself became corrupt. So as where in a movement like the Restoration movement, it would be argued that we need to go back to the Bible, and the problem is that people aren't reading their Bibles right. And if we would just read our Bibles right, we could be New Testament Christians. In Mormonism, the problem is that the entire source of religious authority that Protestants assumed up to that time was being discredited, and that a completely new system of authority needed to be developed, because the problem wasn't just that people were not living Bible lives. The problem was that there was an entire system of thought and priesthood authority that had been lost, and any trace of it had been lost out of the New Testament, and the New Testament had been changed over time. And the Book of Mormon showed the true scripture of God that had been uncorrupted by people. And so Joseph was restoring this uncorrupted scripture that would bring clarity to all the religious confusion with different teachers coming in and out of the burned over district, and that Joseph was to restore this system of prophetic authority which still exists in the LDS Church today. Now, that's a very unique and different way of talking about restoration than what had been assumed in the culture up to that time. And these ideas are not only implicit, but at times explicit. For example, Articles of Faith number 6 about the use of primitivism and restorationism in the Mormon mind. So the current LDS church structure is believed to be a representation not of something new, but of something original, which has been restored. That's why Mormons talk about the restoration of the gospel, because something is being brought back that was lost. So here are the main takeaways from this section on Mormon history. First, restorationism is an idea that existed in North America prior to the American Revolution, and certainly in stronger forms in early American frontier life. It was absolutely prevalent in Joseph Smith's time and space. Mormonism is most certainly a restoration movement, although many Mormons today might not be able to articulate it as how we're speaking about it here. It is kind of built into their sacred narrative, and they assume it as part of their religious identity. So when it comes to engaging Mormons and perhaps disaffected former Mormons, you need to understand that their conception of church authority, of prophecy and inerrancy of the Bible, and anything tied to this or touched by this is heavily influenced by this idea of restoration, and that is their default frame of reference. So when you're trying to make these ideas actionable, you need to understand that why they're not turning to the Bible, why at times the Bible does not seem sufficient to answer the questions they have. It's because there is an entire undergirding foundation that has told them through their entire lives that something was lost that needed to be restored. And if you don't have the restored thing, why have anything at all? So take these points about Mormon history not just as trivia or information, but use it to enhance the way you are engaging with people here in Utah.